All right, so let us go ahead and get started and talk about typography, which is a big subject in and of itself, but we're really just going to focus on 4 different areas. And the first is going to be tracking, which is the space between letters, sometimes referred to as letter spacing. We also have leading, not to be confused with leading, it's pronounced leading, and that's a space between lines of text. We also have font styles, such as serif, sans serif, etc., and font weight that we'll talk about. So let's talk about tracking first. And again, this just adjusts the letter spacing uniformly over a range of characters. So generally speaking, wider tracking is typically used on titles, labels, and watermarks. And in general, in most cases, just stick with the default tracking. So let's take a look at a couple examples. Right here in this paragraph, this is an example of extreme tracking applied onto this paragraph here, and it's just difficult to read. This would be one of those situations where objectively it's a bad decision. You want to make sure you get this nice and tight, and this is default tracking in the case of this font right here. So next up, here's an example where we can actually use a really extended tracking and it would work just well. So notice how it expands out. It's not a large amount of text and it's easy to read. So it's completely fine in this case to use extended tracking. We could also, in a subtle manner, adjust tracking on certain typefaces if you believe that maybe by default things seem too squished in. And here's an example of a really minimized or negative tracking, and it's just too difficult to read. Some people would have a hard time quickly reading this, and you want to avoid such extreme changes on the opposite end as well. Now let's also talk about leading. So we can see clearly here we have a pattern that's been established. We have an article here and an article here. However, this one has extended leading. Whenever you have a pattern of any sort, and this is applicable to pretty much all other UI design fundamentals, you want to apply the same aesthetic here. So using a different leading in these 2 examples comparatively throws off the flow of the design. You don't want to do that. Now, if you wanted to have extended leading, just make sure you apply it to both of them. And of course, if you use too much leading, it's going to be too difficult to read the body of text. So there's definitely a sort of a wiggle room in which there's too little and then there's simply just too much. Now here's an example of the third topic we want to talk about, and that is font style. So above we have this changed from a font this is called Poppins, which is what we were using, and that was a sans serif font. So a sans serif font is just real simple letter type like this, which is what we've been using. In most cases, when it comes to sans serif fonts and the digital world, that's what people are using. Now serif fonts, on the other hand, is an example of the type that's up here. You can see there's just little areas that have been added onto the ends of the letters and the actual letter forms. Now traditionally, serif fonts are seen as professional, authoritative, and sort of old-time-ish, so to speak. And you can actually mix the two. Usually in the case of having either a serif font that's the headline and then the rest of the body being a sans serif, or vice versa. Now one thing you don't want to do is start mixing a bunch of typefaces and fonts on your page. In this case, we have 3 different fonts, and it really throws off the flow of the design because it's not consistent and there's just too much happening in terms of the diversity between the typefaces. Now here's an example of using a font, and in this case it's Comic Sans, and using it improperly based on the context. This is obviously a real serious type of page where we have a stock trading course. This is completely what you don't want to use. If you wanted to use either a serif or a sans serif, that would work perfectly fine. But as you can see, when we go back and forth between the two, the whole mood is completely changed when we go and change it to a sans serif font. Now next up, let's talk about font weight. So here we can see we have this design, and it doesn't have much of what's called visual hierarchy, although it's not too bad. This is certainly made larger. Your eye is definitely drawn towards it more, but we can also reinforce that visual hierarchy through font weight. You can see immediately once we increase the font weight and we make it bolder, your eye is drawn to those areas more so. And one thing you don't want to do is, I've seen some aspiring UI designers do this, when it comes to bodies of text as seen here, don't try to make too many words bold. It makes it difficult for visitors to read. And also, you're not sure exactly where you should focus because so many words have been made bold. So simply revert, and if you have to make something bold, use it sparingly. Now let's also talk here about when can we use a really thin font weight. Well, let's take a look at this. So this is perfectly fine. This is a very thin font weight up here where it says elegance. And it works because it's a large piece of type, and it also has high contrast based on the background. Now, conversely, down here we have relatively small text that is made very thin. This is going to be hard for some people to read. So instead, you want to make sure it is bold enough, especially if it's smaller type for individuals to read. All right, so with that said, we're going to get a lot more practice with typography, of course, going further on in this course. And in the next lesson, we're going to talk about visual hierarchy.